Welcome everyone to the Mysteries Abound podcast. This is your host Paul and this is episode 80. This show's entitled The Uncanny Places on Earth That Look Like Alien Worlds. And to begin the podcast this week, I'm going straight to that article for a change. And it comes from the io9.com website, and it's written by Vince Miklos. And as with this type of article, it is worth a visit to the show notes at www.origins.info to get a close look at the really high quality photographs of these places. We've made huge strides towards finding exoplanets and surveying the other worlds in our solar system recently. But most of us will never know what it's like to stand on another soil, especially under another sun. Good thing there are lots of places on Earth that you could easily mistake for strange new worlds. And that's about all the text that goes with it, so visit the show notes, have a look at them, and read all about it. Sorry it's so short, but it was definitely worth putting in because the photographs are really quite excellent and the places are quite strange and quite unreal. I really like the photograph of the trees in Yemen. They're really, really strange. And from the blogs.smithsonianmag.com website, an article by Hannah Waters. The Enchanting Sea Monsters of Medieval Maps. The sea has been the stage for monstrosities and strange tales since antiquity. And why not? Unlike land, the ocean is constantly shifting and moving, with currents that could carry a ship off course and storms that threaten wrecks. Even the substance itself, seawater, is often cold and dark and deadly to drink in quantity. So, what of the creatures that were thought to live there? The sea monsters that populated European medieval and Renaissance imaginations. Fierce-toothed animals battling in the waves. Long serpents wrapped around ships. Tortuously beautiful sirens. And a wide assortment of chimeric beings are the subject of two new books. Sea Monsters on Medieval and Renaissance Maps by Chet Van Duzer and Sea Monsters, A Voyage Around the World's Most Beguiling Map by Joseph Nigg. Both focus exclusively on illustrations, several of which are included here, of such monsters on old maps. More than mere marginalia and playful illustrations, cartographers drew sea monsters to enchant viewers while educating them about what could be found in the sea. Most of the decorated maps weren't used for navigation, but rather were displayed by wealthy people. That doesn't mean the monsters were purely ornamental inventions, though. To our eyes, almost all of the sea monsters on all of these maps seem quite whimsical. But in fact, a lot of them were taken from what the cartographers viewed as scientific, authoritative books, said Chet Van Duzer. So most of the sea monsters reflect an effort on the part of the cartographer to be accurate in the depiction of what lived in the sea. There was a long-held theory going back to at least the 1st century with Pliny the Elder's Natural History that every land animal has an equivalent in the ocean. They were thought to be sea dogs, sea lions, sea pigs, you name it. Some of these are now the names of real animals. Sea lions are eared seals, and sea pigs are deep-water sea cucumbers, which are tube-like relatives of sea stars with legs. But the medieval imaginings were the literal hybrid of fish with the known land animal. Some of the illustrations, however, are closer to real animals, but warped into monstrous forms. Whales were typically drawn with beastly heads, like a cross between a wolf and a bird, with tusks or large teeth and waterspouts. Despite their generally gentle nature, they were often drawn attacking ships. While it's unlikely that such confrontations were frequent, It's easy to imagine the fear welling up when a sailor spotted the back of a whale longer than his ship rise above the waves. If it jumps from the water, is it on the attack? These uneducated sailors were the main sources for artists and writers trying to describe life in the ocean. So their reports of monsters, from the singing sirens that lure sailors to jump to their deaths, to the lobster-like octopuses and various sea serpents and worms, became the basis of natural history texts and drawings on maps. These maps then helped perpetuate the life of these creatures as they inspired travellers on the dangerous sea to confirm their existence. However, at the end of the 17th century, sea monsters start to disappear from maps. European understanding of science was growing, and the printing press made the spread of realistic images easier. As technology advanced, as our understanding of the oceans and navigation advanced, more emphasis was placed on humans' ability to master the watery element, to sail on it and conduct trade on it, said Van Duzer. And thus images of the dangers of the sea, while they certainly did not immediately disappear from maps in the 17th century, became less frequent over time, and images of ships became more common. There were still illustrations on maps, but they were far more pragmatic. Ships indicated areas of safe passage, while drawings of fish and whales showed good fishing areas. On one map from the early 17th century, vignettes illustrated how to kill and process a whale. Whales, the largest creatures in the ocean, are no longer monsters, but rather natural marine storehouses of commodities to be harvested. Some of the mystery is gone as the sea becomes another resource rather than a churning darkness to be feared. Just when you think that we've lost that sense of awe at the sea, captured in these old maps and texts, we are reminded that much remains to be discovered in the ocean. This year, both the giant squid and the 15-foot megamouth shark were filmed for the first time, and there is still plenty to learn about each. We're still dazzled by bioluminescent light displays in the deep, or the surreal, shimmering movements of schools of millions of tiny fish. The awe continues. It's just based on fact rather than fancy. And this article took my fancy because whilst my wife and I were in London walking down the beautiful antique centres around Portobello Road, I was looking at some of these old maps and things they had on display with these great drawings of these sea monsters. Really interesting stuff. It's a shame they don't make maps like this anymore. And whilst we're talking about strange creatures from the ocean, from the gma.yahoo.com website, an article by Liz Fields. A second sea serpent washes up in California. If good things come in pairs, the discovery of another giant, nearly mystical sea creature should portend positive things for a bunch of bewildered beachgoers who early Friday evening happened across the second so-called discovery of a lifetime in less than a week. The 13.5-foot-long oarfish, which washed up on the beach in Oceanside Harbour, California, is the second of the rarely seen creatures to be found in a matter of days. It's so rare to find in Southern California, especially in surface water, Susanna Cohen of the National Marine Fisheries Service said. They thought it was a very rare event the first time. So these two events that we heard of in the last few weeks are the only ones I've ever heard of. The first discovery was made by a snorkelling marine scientist who wrestled the dead 18-foot monster, with some help, to the shore near Catalina last Sunday. I was thinking, I have no idea what this is, and it looks like a snake, but it kind of looks like a giant eel, said onlooker Andrea Boyle, who was one of a class of third graders on a beach trip when the newest oarfish was found. Boyle was among a crowd of 75 who crowded around the creature as police were called and waited around for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration to come and collect the carcass. Oarfish can grow up to 50 feet in length and live in depths of up to 3,000 feet. Little is known about their habits and life cycles, but the NOAA writes on their website they probably only come to the surface when injured or dying. When the first oarfish was found last week, the Catalina Island Marine Institute hailed it in a news release as a discovery of a lifetime. Mark Waddington, a school training guide with the Institute, told ABC News he spotted another instructor, Jasmine Santana, trying to bring the fish to shore and immediately jumped in to help, along with 15 to 20 others. "I have heard of it in studies, but never thought I would see one in person," said Waddington, who was beside himself when he saw the size of the fish. Divers inspecting a Navy buoy in the Bahamas were the first known to videotape a 5-foot-long oarfish in 2001, claims the NOAA. The terrifying-looking and toothless oarfish is also known as a ribbonfish, possessing bony, silvery bodies and bright red-crested heads. They are thought to have spawned ancient folk tales about sea serpents. And from the www.livescience.com website, an article by Tuan C. Nguyen. History's Most Overlooked Mysteries. The disappearance of the Indus Valley Civilization. With a culture that stretched from Western India to Afghanistan, and a population numbering over 5 million, the ancient Indus Valley people, India's oldest known civilization, were an impressive and apparently sanitary Bronze-aged bunch. The scale of their baffling and abrupt collapse rivals that of the great Mayan decline. But it wasn't until 1922 that excavations revealed a hygienically advanced culture, which maintained a sophisticated sewage drainage system and immaculate bathrooms. Strangely, there is no archaeological evidence of armies, slaves, social conflicts or other vices prevalent in ancient societies. Even to the very end, it seems, they kept it clean. The Tarim Mummies. During an excavation beneath the Tarim Basin in western China, archaeologists were surprised to discover more than 100 mummified corpses that dated back 2,000 years. But a college professor named Victor Mayer was downright stupefied when he came skull to skull with some of the blonde-haired and long-nosed Tarim mummies after they were dug up and put on display at a museum. So in 1993, Mayer returned to collect DNA samples from the mummies. Test results ultimately validated his hunch that the bodies were of European genetic stock. While ancient Chinese texts from as early as the 1st millennium BC describe groups of Far East-dwelling Caucasian people, there is no mention of how or why they ended up there. And here's one that keeps popping up in the stories that I do. The Voynich manuscript. The Voynich manuscript just might be the most unreadable book in the world. The 500-year-old relic was discovered in 1912 at a library in Rome and consists of 240 pages of illustrations and writing in a language not known to anyone. Deciphering the text has eluded even the best cryptographers, leading some to dismiss the book as an entertaining but lengthy hoax. But a statistical analysis of the writing shows that the manuscript does seem to follow the basic structure and laws of a working language. The Lost Roman Legion. After the Parthians of Persia defeated an underachieving Roman army led by General Crassus, legend has it that a small band of POWs wandered through the desert and were eventually rounded up by the Han military. First century Chinese historian Ban Zhu wrote an account of a confrontation with a strange army that fought in a fish-scale formation unique to Roman forces. An Oxford historian who compared ancient records claimed that the lost Roman legion founded a small town near the Gobi Desert named Liquian, which in Chinese translates to Rome. DNA tests are being conducted to settle that claim and hopefully explain some of the residents' green eyes, blonde hair, and fondness of bullfighting. Who was Robin Hood? The real-life existence of a forest-dwelling altruistic band definitely seems more plausible than a legendary king with a magical sword. However, the historical manhunt for the real-life Robin Hood has turned up entire scrolls of possibilities. Candidates include a fugitive in Yorkshire by the name of Robert Hod, who went by Hobby Hod, as well as Robert Hood of Wakefield. The list of suspects was also complicated by the name Robin Hood eventually being synonymous with being an outlaw. His identity would later get murkier as the tale's authors wove more characters, such as Prince John and Richard the Lionheart, into the story. The Karnak Stones. If erecting Stonehenge seemed to have been a tremendous groan, think about the back-breaking it must have been for the folks responsible for the Karnak Stones. On the coast of Brittany in northwestern France are over 3,000 megalithic stones standing arranged in perfect lines and spread out over 12 kilometres. The local myth is that a Roman legion was on the march when the wizard Merlin turned them into stone. A more rational stab at an explanation by a researcher who studied the stones purported that the stones may have been an elaborate earthquake detector. The identity of the Neolithic people who built them is unknown. Fall of the Minoans. As historians squabble over what caused the collapse of the Roman Empire, the fall of the Minoan Empire has proved just as puzzling. 3.5 millennia ago, life on Crete, the island residence of a mythical king and his man-eating beast, was disrupted by a volcanic eruption from neighbouring Thera Island. Clay tablets unearthed by archaeologists revealed that instead of folding, Minoans carried on for another 50 years before finally packing it in. Theories of what finally did them in include a scenario in which a blanket of volcanic ash devastated crops, and one where a weakened society was left vulnerable to an eventual Greek takeover. The bog bodies. Even CSI's best efforts wouldn't go very far in solving the mystery of the bog bodies. Hundreds of these ancient corpses have been discovered buried around the northern wetlands of Europe. Researchers who inspected the remains have reported telltale signs of torture and medieval foul play. Such gruesome clues have some suspecting that the dead were victims of ritual sacrifice. The lost city of Helike. Greek writer Pausanias gave an account of how a great earthquake destroyed the city of Helike. Moments later, a tsunami swept away what remained of the once flourishing metropolis, which had been a worship centre devoted to Poseidon, Earthshaker and god of the sea. No trace of the legendary society existed outside of ancient Greek texts until 1861, when an archaeologist found a bronze coin with the unmistakable head of Poseidon. In 2001, a pair of archaeologists located the ruins of Helike beneath coastal mud and gravel. They are now working to unearth what some consider the real Atlantis. And finally, something we've touched on before, Rongo Rongo. Considered the other Easter Island mystery, Rongo Rongo is an indecipherable hieroglyphic script used by the region's early inhabitants. While no other neighbouring oceanic people possessed a written language, Rongo Rongo appeared mysteriously in the 1700s. However, the language was lost, along with the best hopes of deciphering it, after early European colonisers banned it because of ties to the islanders' pagan roots. In my opinion, Australia has some of the most beautiful women in the world. And of course I remember the story about the American sea captain who was visiting our northern city of Darwin, which is in the very, very hot tropics, and complaining that our women wore too little clothing. Now, how silly is that? Well, from that you can tell that we Australians are quite a sexy lot, and that even includes some of our animals. I found this article on the HuffingtonPost.com, and it's written by Tony Phillips, and it's about the Antechinus, our tiny marsupials that mate themselves to death. Males of the genus Antechinus, once called marsupial mice, mature quickly and mate repeatedly during a short breeding season, humping away until they're totally played out. Then they die, and males of all other species are jealous. Antechinni are native only to Australia, Tasmania and New Guinea. Male brown Antechinni from Australia's southeast coast die after their first breeding season, which lasts 2 weeks as a result of stress, exhaustion and starvation. They have a lifespan of just under a year, making it through one breeding season, during which time there's some serious thunder down under. Males can spend up to 14 hours mating non-stop. I think if you experience an erection lasting more than 4 hours, you're supposed to see a doctor. Clearly, it's a different story for the Antechinus. From what I've read about these randy rascals, it seems that come breeding time, males strip their bodies of vital proteins and suppress their immune systems so as to free up additional metabolic energy. In this way, an individual male trades away long-term survival for short-term breeding success. In short, he produces more and better sperm. Females who live through 2 and sometimes 3 breeding cycles have litters of baby Antechinus with individuals sired by 2, sometimes 3 different males. Increasing the likelihood of multiple paternities is the fact that females can store sperm for up to 3 days in specialised sperm storage crypts in their ovaries. Obviously, a marsupial's lifestyle is not to be emulated, unless you're a Kardashian. In a recent study, Diana Fisher, a researcher at the University of Queensland, reports that the strategy called suicidal reproduction is a simple equation for the short-lived males. In the October 7 proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Fisher shows that males give themselves entirely to the breeding process in order to fertilise females with the highest quality sperm possible. Fisher and her team found that compared to other marsupials, Antechinus have much larger testes relative to body size, and big marsupial mouse balls are better for storing marsupial mouse sperm. Their gargantuan gonads are so efficient at cranking out baby batter, they actually stop producing sperm before mating begins. According to Fisher, this is so that they can pull all of their energy into non-stop mating sessions. She said, they must rely on stored sperm throughout the mating season, and the clock is ticking, because the limited store of sperm is continually lost in their urine. They have a frenzied mating season lasting only a couple of weeks, and males usually die before young are born. And if this isn't cool enough, she added, this is a form of post-mating sexual selection in which males compete with their sperm inside the female reproductive tract, rather than fighting to gain access to females. It is associated with having large testes with lots of sperm-producing tissue, and often also long mating times and mate guarding, and of course, promiscuity. Not making it past adolescence is a shame and all that, but we're talking about a life that extends over the course of a year, and as it builds to a crescendo, consists of growing a pair of balloon-like boys that then get pressed into service for 14-hour sexathons back-to-back for 2 weeks. Then you slip into a haze of post-coital exhaustion and die. Then the jukebox plays Freebird. Well done, sir. Well done indeed. And now a story to bring us back from our heights of envy. From the www.curiositas.com website, The Incredible Dinosaur Wall of Bolivia. And as with this website, there is narration, but it's always worth a visit to the show notes to see the photographs of the incredible things that this website highlights. Some things appear where you least expect them. Although dinosaur tracks have been discovered the world over, climbing up a near vertical wall in a Bolivian quarry? Bolivia, yes, fine. Zooming up hundreds of feet towards the skies? Hardly. Yet here they are, spread across a limestone slab a mile long and almost 300 feet high. This great wall at Calauco near the city of Suvra reveals more than 5,000 footsteps with 462 discrete trails. Yet 68 million years ago, give or take a million or two, this immense vertical wall was a muddy plain across which dinosaurs danced. Although the last verb is not one usually common in describing events from the Jurassic period, puzzled paleontologists have called it the dinosaur dance floor because many of the prints are positioned in strange patterns. Back in the Cretaceous period, Calauco bordered a vast lake. It was here that the first flowers bloomed on the continent, and it was not long before they attracted herbivores. It was only a short time afterwards that carnivores, including the favourite of many, T-Rex, moved in too. As this melee of creatures moved around the shoreline, they left their footprints in the mud. We have the variations of the climate to thank for their preservation. A period of dry weather solidified the prints. Then when wet weather came around again, they were buried under sediment and more mud. There are 7 layers of footprints made in this manner at Calauco. The tectonic movements of the Earth's plates pushed the flats and their footprints inexorably upwards. Nature made the perfect viewing angle for the scattered tracks of the dancing dinosaurs. Across the mudflats all those millions of years ago, a baby Tyrannosaurus rex made its solitary way across the banks of the lake. All told, his tracks extend for 347 metres and are the longest dino tracks ever discovered. The baby Rex even acquired a nickname, Johnny Walker. Almost all of the prints are so well preserved that the individual species which made them can be ascertained. As well as Johnny Walker, about 8 species have been recognised. They include the Ankylosaurus, the Titanosaur and Carnotaurus. Paleontologists have been able to establish a real idea of the speed at which the dinosaurs crossed the muddy bank by studying the depth of the prints and the number of toes which were plunged into the thick mud by the enormous beasts. Unfortunately, these tracks will be lucky to last another 10 years, let alone 10 million. Erosion and mining in the vicinity means that landslides are common. Whole slabs of the trails have fallen off since they first appeared on the cliff face. Yet locals are not pessimistic. They believe that below these tracks perhaps something more incredible lies in wait to be discovered. Anyway, like I said, visit the show notes, have a look at these footprints. They're quite amazing, and the vertical display is sort of all the more spectacular. And now to the www.futilitycloset.com website. And this website describes itself as an idler's miscellany of compendious amusements. In other words, short, interesting little articles or quotes from various places and various times. The first is the Solway Firth Spaceman. On May 23, 1964, Cumberland firefighter Jim Templeton visiting Burgh Marsh in Cumbria, England, when he snapped 3 photos of his 5-year-old daughter Elizabeth. When the pictures were developed, he was surprised to see what looked like a spaceman in the background of one of them. Templeton told reporters, "I took the picture to the police in Carlisle, who, after many doubts, examined it and stated there was nothing suspicious about it. The local newspaper, the Cumberland News, picked up the story, and within hours it was all over the world. The picture is certainly not a fake, and I am bemused as anyone else as to how this figure appeared in the background. Over the 4 decades the photograph has been in the public domain, I have had many thousands of letters from all over the world with various ideas or possibilities, most of which make little sense to me. The best guess seems to be that the figure is Templeton's wife, Annie, who had dark bobbed hair and was wearing a pale blue dress that appeared white in the other photos taken that day. The camera's viewfinder obscured part of the image, so it would have been possible for him to take the photo without realising that Annie was in the shot. But who knows? And of course the photograph is in this article if you'd like to have a look. A perpetual pussycat. When Winston Churchill died in 1965, he left his country home Chartwell to the government with a curious stipulation. It must always maintain, in comfortable residence, a marmalade cat named Jock. The original Jock had been given to Churchill 2 years before his death by his private secretary, Sir John Jock Colville, and quickly became a favourite. When the cat died in 1975, 10 years after the Prime Minister, he was replaced with a Jock II, and the line has continued. The current resident is Jock V, who jumps into the sink at every opportunity. Damn ambitious. German architect Hermann Sorgel's plan to drain the Mediterranean was only the beginning. He also wanted to irrigate Africa by creating an enormous pair of artificial seas. By damming the Congo River, he would create a gigantic lake in the centre of the continent. He calculated that this would cause the Ubangi River to reverse its course, flowing northwest into the Chari River and creating a huge Chad Sea that would seek an outlet in the north, a second Nile that would irrigate Algeria. Between them, these new seas would cover 10% of the continent. Soergel also wanted to build a gigantic hydroelectric plant at Stanley Falls, whose power could bring light and industry to much of Africa. But the plans came to nothing. The scale of such a project is beyond colossal and is utterly unfeasible politically, writes Franklin Hadley Cock in Energy Demand and Climate Change. Its hydroelectric power potential is staggering, as are the environmental and human problems building it would cause. Greenpeace. In December 1868, having just turned 33, Andrew Carnegie sat down in New York's St. Nicholas Hotel and wrote a memo to himself. His net worth was $400,000, and with prudent management he could expect $50,000 in dividends each year for the rest of his life. Beyond this, never earn, he resolved. Make no effort to increase fortune, but spend the surplus each year for benevolent purposes. Cast aside business forever except for others. Man must have an idol. The amassing of wealth is one of the worst species of idolatry. No idol more debasing than the worship of money. Whatever I engage in, I must push inordinately, therefore, should I be careful to choose that life which will be the most elevating in its character. To continue much longer overwhelmed by business cares, and with most of my thoughts wholly upon the way to make more money in the shortest time, must degrade me beyond hope of permanent recovery. He kept the memo for the rest of his life, and by the time of his death in 1919, he had given away $350,695,650, nearly $5 billion today, endowing universities, museums, libraries and initiatives to support science, the arts and world peace. The man who dies rich dies disgraced, he wrote. Money can only be the useful drudge of things immeasurably higher than itself. Mine be it to have contributed to the enlightenment and the joys of the mind, to the things of the spirit, to all that tends to bring into the lives of the toilers of Pittsburgh sweetness and light. I hold this the noblest possible use of wealth. And to round up this little set of stories, the Sourdough Expedition. In 1910, 4 years after Frederick Cook claimed falsely to have reached the peak of Mount McKinley, an unlikely quartet of Alaskan gold miners, Tom Lloyd, Peter Anderson, Billy Taylor and Charles McGonigal, announced that they had planted a spruce pole on the mountain's 19,470-foot north summit. Though using rudimentary equipment and not acclimated to the altitude, they claimed to have made the final 8,000-foot climb and descent in only 18 hours, carrying the heavy pole and fueled only by hot chocolate and donuts. President Taft congratulated them on the feat, which the New York Times said was undertaken not for the enlightenment of the world, but to prove the pluck and endurance of the members of the party. But Lloyd's exaggerated accounts began to draw scepticism. He claimed to have joined his companions on the summit, when it appears he had remained in camp. And these only grew when the party could produce no photographs taken above 11,000 feet. But 3 years later, Hudson Stuck conquered the main summit and reported that, using binoculars, he had seen a large pole near the North Peak. The pole has since been lost, but today it's generally believed that the Sourdough Expedition did succeed in reaching its goal. In 1914, Stuck wrote, "To Pete Anderson and Billy Taylor, 2 of the strongest men physically in all of the North, and to none other belongs the honour of the first ascent of the North Peak and the planting of what must assuredly be the highest flagstaff in the world." And from the jalopnik.com website, an article by Michael Balaban. This insane rocket is why the Soviet Union never made it to the moon. Americans tend to talk a lot about the space race and how we made it to the moon, and we were first and no one else was second because we are the best. It's put into context by the fact that the Soviet satellite Sputnik was the first in space. But by the time we get around to discussing the moon landings, no one mentions why. And this enormous, absolutely insane rocket is the reason. Sure, one could go in and argue that the failure of the Soviet Union to make it to the moon was a result of an incompatible governing system, or economic hurdles, or a myriad of other factors contributed to the communist nation never placing a human on the lunar surface. But they all culminated in this, the N1 rocket. If you were an alien observing Earth sometime around January 1962, you may be forgiven for placing a bet on the Soviet Union as the eventual winner of the space race. They had gotten the first satellite into space, the first animal into space, and not only the first human into space with cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, but they also had him orbit the Earth. Americans had managed to come in second every time, and the only manned spaceflight they accomplished was a simple suborbital flight. And in case you're not sure what that means, it means that they had astronaut Alan Shepard shoot straight up and straight down, and that was it. He was in flight for less than half an hour. The space race effectively ended with the landing of Apollo 11 on the moon in July 1969. Where were the Soviets though? Shouldn't they have been the ones saying, "The bear has landed," on the powdery grey landscape? The N1 rocket that they created to take them there was almost as big as the Saturn V that took Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins to the moon. It was a bit shorter and a bit lighter, but it had more thrust out of the gate. How it got that massive boost was probably its downfall. As you can see from the picture above, and you'll need to visit the show notes to see that, the N1 had a lot of engines, whereas the Saturn V was powered by only 5 enormous engines. The N1 had 30 little ones. 24 of them formed a ring around the outside of Block A, the name for the first stage, with 6 placed in the centre to provide roll control. The thinking was that if one of these small little engines was good, then strapping them all together would be great. This idea went horribly wrong though. Think about it this way. The Saturn V, with its comparatively simple system, still had over 6 million different parts. If only 0.1% of those parts broke during the horrifically violent event that is a rocket launch, over 6,000 would still break, leading to instantaneous, fiery death. Not good. And yet the Saturn V itself never resulted in a fatality. The Apollo 1 astronauts were tragically killed, but that was due to a failure in the command capsule oxygen system. The Soviet system was infamous for poor quality work, and when you get 30 engines in one single stage, place them all right next to each other, and light the match, a failure of one would lead to an extremely fast domino effect, which would lead to a massive explosion, which is exactly what happened. Of the 4 N1 test launches, all of them failed. None so spectacularly though as the second launch attempt. The N1 seemed to adhere to the rule of what goes up must come down more than any other in Newtonian physics, and shortly after lifting off from the launch pad, it came right back down, crashing to Earth and combusting. It turns out a bolt had come loose and was sucked straight into an oxygen pump fueling one of the 30 little engines, which then promptly exploded, setting off a chain reaction. The rocket exploded with the force of 7 kilotons of TNT, equivalent to a small nuclear bomb. It remains one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in human history. The destruction was so vast, in fact, that it let the Americans know what the Soviet Union was up to when satellites photographed the wrecked launch pad. It took 18 months for the USSR to rebuild it. This time they installed fuel filters. Oh, and the entire thing was fueled by kerosene. It's not quite a lamp, this thing. The fourth and final unsuccessful N1 launch in 1972 also resulted in a massive explosion, this time from a phenomenon known as pogo oscillation. Pogo oscillation is exactly what it sounds like, a violent up and down motion that could make anybody sick, but makes rockets really, really sick. It results from a variation in thrust from different engines, and with 30 unreliable ones, you can get a lot of vibrations. Once it starts, it's very hard to correct, as the variable acceleration leads to variable fuel pump pressures, which leads to more variable acceleration, and so on, until eventually you match the vehicle's resonance frequency and vibrate the whole thing to death. This time the N1 managed to get up to 40 kilometres in altitude before it encountered the dreaded pogo oscillation. An orderly shutdown of the engines was begun, which sounds easy enough. Of course, because this was the Soviet Union and the N1, it didn't exactly go according to plan. Instead of shutting down, one of the liquid oxygen pumps, of course, exploded, and another enormous boom resulted. With that, the Soviet Union decided to pack it in on its plans to put a person on the moon. Although the US found out about the whole program due to satellite overflights, it was officially denied by the USSR until 1989, as it was thought to be such a huge embarrassment. By then, it would only be 2 years until the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics would disintegrate itself. The music for today's podcast came from the musicalley.com website. The bandwidth was provided by TalkShoe at www.talkshoe.com. The show notes are kept at the Origins podcast website, www.origins.info. And don't forget we have a Facebook page, www.facebook.com/Paul Rexy, or just click on the Facebook link at the show notes. And I'd like to say a big thank you to these people who have been kind enough to make a donation to the podcast in the last few days. Sean Yarnell, thank you Sean, you're a great supporter. Eric Prouty, Alonzo Delgado, Phil Cross, Diane Rowley, Norman Birthmark and Robert Kundik. Thank you everyone, your help and support is greatly appreciated. Now, for those of you who have been visiting the podcast Facebook page, you will know that I have generated a discussion about whether I could introduce a subscribed podcast. I'd still keep doing Mysteries Abound and Origins, of course, but because of all the time and effort that goes into their production, if I do introduce another one, I would like it to be a subscription service for something like, say, $3 a month, and it would be a weekly podcast. Anyway, when looking at the discussion on the Facebook page, it seemed that there was interest from a number of listeners. And if you'd like to contribute your thoughts and ideas to the discussion, I would really appreciate what you think. It will give me an idea as to whether I should go ahead or not. days, and the news had not come as a shock to any of the family. She'd had 2 previous heart attacks, and with her smoking and drinking, she wasn't exactly in the best of health. It had been a surprise that she wanted me to have the old family home, though. I'd never exactly had much love for the place, and had moved out the first chance I got. Honestly, I hadn't been expecting to get anything in the will, given how long it had been since we'd even spoken. I was surprised saying that he'd not even noticed it before now. My cousin said that she'd noticed a big old-fashioned looking key in the keyhole of the door last time she'd come round to visit, but she had no clue where it might be right now. I shrugged, not really thinking much of it at the time, just figuring that I'd have to get someone to bust the door down at some point before I got the house sold. The room none of us wanted to go in was Emerson's. It was weird, seeing all his old toys and colouring books still there, as if our mother had been trying to bring her son back by clinging on to the past. Emerson had always been our mother's favourite, the one whom she'd lavished all of her attention on, and I saw that she had stuck his drawings up all over the place. Drawings of pirate ships and odd, comical-looking figures with strange designs. My brother told me that when he'd stayed for dinner, our mother would still set a place for Emerson, as if she expected him to just show up out of the blue. Would go back to bed, and then after a little while the noises would start up again. Sometimes I was sure that I could hear music as well. It was around 4 in the morning that a thought occurred to me, and I went to the locked door in the hallway, pressing my ear against it and listening closely. I was sure I heard what sounded like a muffled tune coming from within. The next day I went into town to buy some food, and after the events of last night I also bought a hammer to knock down that old door. It was while chatting with the cashier that I learned something unsettling about the neighbourhood that I had temporarily moved into. I had casually brought up where I was staying after he commented on me being new around here, and told him that I was planning to try and sell up. He'd let out a short burst of laughter before looking embarrassed about it, and when I asked him to explain, had said the following: "No one with sense is going to buy that dump. No one with half a brain would buy any house within 10 miles of that place, he said, not looking up from the groceries he was packing away. Why not? Seems like a nice neighbourhood, I had replied. Because of all them kids going missing, of course. He'd gone on to explain that for the past few years there had been a sudden and disturbing rise in the number of children vanishing from their homes in the area. There had been search parties formed, the police and the FBI had gotten involved, but nothing had turned up. The kids vanished from their homes with no signs of forced entry or struggle and no evidence left behind as to who might have been responsible. People were trying to move away as fast as possible, but there were few who would buy a house in the area once they heard about what was going on. No one wanted to move to a place where a child kidnapper or killer was active. I have to admit the story kind of creeped me out. Knowing that something so strange was going on near where I was staying made the odd goings-on of the previous night seem even more unsettling to me, and as soon as I got home I decided to bust that door down. My neighbour, a fairly nice young woman named Charlie, whom I'd gotten to know, was working on her home's front lawn when I got back and noticed the hammer in my hand as I headed towards the front door of my home. Not really wanting to be alone when I broke the door down, I gave her an abridged version of events, leaving out the odd noises of last night, and asked if she'd like to join me in finding out what was in the room. Mysterious locked door. Very Scooby-Doo, she said as I grinned. Sure, I'll be Fred and you be Daphne, I replied, happy to have someone with me. Her presence making the nervousness I had felt while listening to the cashier's story start to fade a little. Trust me, I'm more Velma than Daphne. Once inside the house, I packed away the various groceries, pouring drinks for myself and Charlie before we went to the white door. It only took a few swings from the hammer to smash it open, the lock breaking beneath the assault and the door swinging open. Behind it was a staircase, leading down into a darkened basement below. I stared in confusion at the stairs, not believing what I was seeing. Our house didn't have a basement. I was sure of that. And yet suddenly I seemed to recall seeing this before. I could remember playing with Emerson one day, daring each other. Emerson had always been afraid of pretty much everything, and I, in the way of older brothers everywhere, had taken far too much pleasure in tormenting him. I seemed to remember the two of us at the top of the stairs, me daring him to go down into the dark while calling him a chicken. "Come on, Emerson," I had been saying to him, "you have to go inside." Charlie and I began to descend the old creaking steps towards the basement, the hammer still clutched tightly in my hands. I didn't know what we would find, but I knew that I felt better being armed with something that could do some damage. As we reached the bottom of the stairs, Charlie began feeling around for a light switch, finding one after a few moments and flicking it on. The room was instantly illuminated, revealing what was inside. "Oh my God, look at all this cool stuff," Charlie cried out. The basement was full of puppets. There were dozens of them, all lined up on various shelves, all in very good repair, as if they were brand new. There were puppets of all shapes and sizes, some of them being very human-looking, while others were Muppet-like animal creatures, and others were more monstrous. There were props from what looked like the set of a kids' show, I guess. None of it had any dust on it, as if someone had been down to tidy up just moments before. I could guess what all of this was from, but what was it doing down here? I had no idea. "What is all of this?" Charlie asked as she picked up one of the puppets, a guy with a massive moustache and a monocle over one eye. She grinned, playing around with him, moving his limbs up and down. "My brother used to work on a kids' show years ago. Pirate Place, I think it was called. Only ran for a couple of years before it got cancelled. I guess this stuff is all the old puppets and sets from the show," I said as we looked around at the room. My eyes fell on a creepy-looking skeleton puppet with a really weird mouth and a top hat upon his head. Ugly-looking thing, I thought to myself at that moment. No way! Do you have any idea how much some of this stuff might be worth? Collectors pay a fortune for things like this on eBay, Charlie said, setting the puppet down gently on one of the shelves. I glanced around at the rest of the contents of the room. Apart from the puppets and the set pieces, there was an old sewing machine set on a desk that was otherwise completely bare. There was no sign of anything that could have been the source of that tune that I'd heard before. Deciding that I must have imagined it, probably due to lack of sleep and being back in the old place, I did my best to forget about my fears and concentrate on the opportunity before me right now. There was just one thing that troubled me as I looked around. On the desk the sewing machine was set on, there were several odd red stains spattered over it. I stared at them. I was sure, out of the corner of my eye, that the odd-looking skeleton puppet's head had twitched in my direction. The next few days went by without anything odd happening, really. I put the puppets up on eBay and had a few people come to view the house. The only thing that was strange was when one couple viewed the basement. All of the colour drained out of the husband's face when his eyes fell on the skeleton puppet, and he just turned, left the basement, and then the house. He went to the car, started it up, and sat there until his wife joined him, after apologising for his rudeness, and the two drove away. Later that night I was sure I heard the old sewing machine in the basement. I wanted to go down and check it, and yet at the same time looking at that darkened doorway, I suddenly felt very frightened. And when there was a knock at the door, the sudden noise almost made me jump out of my skin. My head jerking to the side towards the source of the noise. Taking a moment to steady my nerves, I walked to the door, opening it cautiously to see Charlie standing there. "We need to talk," she said. She explained that she'd mentioned to a friend of hers about the find in the basement a few days ago. When she'd brought up the name Pirate Place, he'd gone quiet and asked for her to describe the puppets. He looked afraid, she said, as if he'd just seen a ghost. He had told her to move house, to get away from me and from those damn things, as he referred to the puppets, growing increasingly hysterical as the conversation had gone on. He repeated over and over that it wasn't safe to be around them, that they could see you through them. He'd rambled at length about physical avatars and the signal, none of which had made any sense to her. Apparently he used to work in television and had known my brother. He said that he had sat down with Emerson in what he called the script room, and then started raving about knowing where the stories come from. Charlie said that she had never seen him like this before, that he seemed to be almost psychotic, his eyes bugging out of his head, his face glistening with sweat. She had been worried that he was about to have some kind of attack. "Was your brother involved in anything weird?" she asked me, and I honestly didn't know how to respond to that. Emerson had always been an odd kid, no doubt about that, but I couldn't imagine him ever provoking such a frightened reaction in anyone, let alone a grown man. I asked her if he'd said why the puppets were so awful, and she shrugged. All the stuff he was saying wasn't making much sense. He just said, "It's not the puppets, it's what made them." And then he just got up and said he couldn't be in my house anymore, just ran out to his car and drove off. I decided that as she'd shared her weirdness with me, maybe I could open up about some of the weirdness in my life right now. I explained about the odd noises, the music and the sewing machine seeming to turn itself on. And against my better judgment, we decided to descend into that pitch-black basement once again. I'm not sure what I expected to find, but I was sure that something would be wrong. So when we saw that nothing seemed to have changed or been moved, I felt an odd sense of almost disappointment. I kind of wanted for there to be something strange down there, just to prove that I wasn't imagining all of this, to prove to myself that I wasn't going crazy. And that's when Charlie spotted the door. It was when she flicked off the light as we began to go up. Casting one last look back into the darkness, and noticed that there was light coming from somewhere. Not very bright, but nonetheless a light source. Moving swiftly, we shoved aside one of the shelves of the puppets and felt along the wall behind it. To confirm what Charlie had believed to be the case, there was a door behind it. "Told you this was all kinds of Scooby-Doo," Charlie said with a grin on her face, clearly enjoying herself. I smiled, which was something I definitely wouldn't have been able to do if she wasn't there. It was nice to have someone to share this insanity with. We felt along the wall, trying to find some way to open the door, some handle or switch to make it open. From behind it, I was sure that I could hear something. It sounded almost like music, circus music, a cheerful, upbeat tune, but also off somehow, as if there was something not quite right about it. Out of the corner of my eye, I was sure that the puppet with the ridiculous moustache and monocle had moved, and I realised how ridiculous that sounds, but I was certain of it. It was just the tiniest movement, a twitch of its head towards the skeleton puppet, as if waiting for orders, I thought to myself, and then wondered why that had popped into my head. With a bit of work, we managed to strip away the wallpaper that was covering most of the door, revealing that it was bright red in colour, the paint chipped and flaking in places with a small keyhole and no handle. I assumed that it just pushed inwards once unlocked and perhaps slid to the side, as there was no place for a handle to have once been either. It was then that I noticed that Charlie had stopped smiling. In fact, she was staring at the door with what looked like a mixture of confusion and fear, taking a few steps back from it. When I asked her what was wrong, she just shook her head and made excuses to leave. I asked her if she was all right, and she just told me she was tired and promised to help me try and find a key to the door in the morning. It was getting late, so it was plausible enough, but I knew that something was wrong here. For the rest of the evening I looked through Emerson's old things in his room, looking for some clue as to what it was that inspired such fear in Charlie's friend. For the most part it was old toys and childhood drawings. Nothing of much use. There were a few things that were odd, though. It was a picture that I guess Emerson had done when he was little. There was a crude drawing of a boy sat in his bed that I think was meant to be Emerson himself. Around him were stood several figures. One was just a stick figure with a hat upon its head. Another was a portly man with a cartoonish moustache and teeth. And then there was a third. That was very odd. It was just a scribble in the outline of a person, a black, shadowy scribble. There was a circle drawn above the three figures, and the boy and lines were shown coming down from it leading to the boy's head. For some reason, looking at those lines, the word tendrils came into my head. There was a picture of a red door. The words, "Where they take them," were scrawled in large letters beneath. And the final picture of the stick man and the man with the moustache leading several smaller figures towards a third. This one was a woman, a rather well-drawn one in comparison to the crude, basic nature of the others, except for the face. The face was just two dots for eyes and a line for the mouth. The words, "Where they take them," were written here as well. There was a message on my answering machine from Charlie the next day. She said that she'd gone to stay with her girlfriend for a few days, just to clear her head, and apologised for leaving so suddenly the previous night. Her voice sounded odd, kind of shaky really, and she said not to bother with the door. She tried to sound calm and casual when she said it, but there was fear in her voice. She said it was probably best to forget all about the whole thing and just cover up the basement, not even mention it to potential buyers for the house. She said it would be a good idea to take the puppets off eBay as well. I should have done as she asked. Instead, I spent the rest of the day ransacking the house, searching for the key to that door. I looked everywhere with little success until, almost on a whim, I decided to search Emerson's room more thoroughly. And there, hidden in one of his old pillowcases, was a key. I poured myself a drink to steady my nerves, sitting down to watch the TV. I remembered the old thing never picking up much when we were little, the channels always being full of static. It seemed to be working better now at least, and the news came on, talking about another disappearance in the area. A girl of 12 this time, vanished from her home in the middle of the night. I flipped through the channels looking for something a little less grim while I finished my drink. Getting up, I headed down the steps into the basement, striding towards the door, ready to open it. The skeleton puppet was sat at the sewing machine now. I knew I hadn't moved it, and neither had Charlie. And the other puppets, their heads seemed to be turned towards it, as if they were waiting for it to do something, to say something. God, it was a hideous thing, that awful misshapen mouth looking so awful. God knows why the prop designer had made it look that way. At that moment, the words, "to grind your skin," popped into my head. I put the key into the door, and sure enough it unlocked it, the door pushing inward with ease, revealing the room that lay beyond it. It was illuminated by a single dirty bulb, making the contents of the room easy to see. Dear Lord, the smell. The only thing worse was the sight of what littered around the room. Children's shoes and clothes, some spattered with old, dried blood, were piled in a heap in one corner of the room. The floor was stained with large patches of red, one of which, as I stepped into it, I realised was still somewhat fresh. Fresh and sticky like soda spilled on a movie theatre floor. The room smelt of spoiling meat and burnt hair, and it took all I had not to throw up as I entered it, wondering how the smell hadn't travelled from this room to the basement. There was a pile of old video cassettes in one corner of the room, all labelled with things like Emerson's First Bike Ride and Emerson's First Spelling Bee. All old home movies, I guess, but mixed in with them were tapes labelled Candle Cove Episode 4 and Season 3 Pilot Episode. I picked up a few and noticed that there were bloody fingerprints on several. There was a series of steps leading down further into the blackness at the rear of the room, and I felt oddly compelled to go down there. How far did this go? How was this even here beneath my family home without me ever knowing of it? And yet I felt like I did know about it. Looking at those steps, I felt like I remembered being in this room before. I was a child, and it had been empty then, and there I stood with Emerson at the foot of these stairs. "Emerson, you have to go inside," I whispered to him, taking delight in how terrified he looked, and he had gone down into the dark, and my head throbbed with pain. It actually hurt physically to try and remember, as if something was willing me not to. Had there been someone down there with us? I was sure I remembered there being someone in the room besides the two of us, the more I thought about it. Our mother? No, not our mother, but another woman. Why couldn't I remember her face? I began to take unsteady steps down the stairs. The more I walked, the closer I got to another door. Another red door. The key fit the lock of this one as well, and it opened with ease. There was music coming from within now, and the sound of waves crashing against the shore. I felt it pulling me towards it, calling me like a siren song. I had to go inside, I thought to myself. I had to go inside. I wasn't alone in this room. I burned all the puppets later that night. Not that I imagine it matters. They've been destroyed before, and it hasn't stopped them from coming back. They're just wood and paint and cloth, nothing but a conduit. They allow them to come through, allow them to walk through the door and come here. Oh God, the door. I know where they go now. I know where they go. Oh Christ. Oh Jesus, please help me. I know where they go. I saw it. They took me there, the way they took my brother when he was a child. They need us. I don't know why they need us, but they need us. That's what he said. Through that horrible misshapen mouth, those eyes rolling in his sockets wildly. They needed my brother, and they need me. My family is not safe. The signal needs us. The story needs us. The ship came to that cave. Emerson was laughing and crying at the same time as he spoke the words I knew were coming, and he told me what I had to do. It was waiting for me. I saw the following portion of the letter has been heavily crossed out, making it almost impossible to read. A word that may or may not be mannequin appears at one point in the letter, and the word skin is visible at several points in the following 2 paragraphs. What could be faker or taker can also be made out in the 2nd paragraph, and ship in the final sentence. The letter resumes. I ran. You may think me a coward for not helping them, not even trying to save them, but I know where the ship is taking them now. I know where the voyage leads, and I know who is waiting at the end. I would pray to God, but now that will do no good. I know now. I know things that no one should ever know. I know what Emerson learned that day the signal found him. I know the things he learned in the dark places where the music comes from. Music played on instruments crafted of bone and organs wrapped in flesh. It's always there now in my head, playing on an endless loop. The signal has found me, like it found Emerson that day I made him go down the stairs. Like it found our mother. I know why she did what she did. I know what she knew, and I know where Emerson is. I saw him on the ship. My God, the ship. The laughing was the worst. I wish it would stop laughing. I have sealed up the basement, but know that one day someone will go down there again. I write this so that when they discover the things I know, they will find down there they will know neither I nor my mother were responsible. And perhaps so they will have the courage to do what I do not and destroy this terrible place, burn it to the ground. The only thing that holds me back is the fear that perhaps this place is not merely the door to their cage, but the cage itself. If the house were to be destroyed, perhaps they would be able to spread. I wish to apologise to my family. I hope they will forgive me for what I am about to do. I hope they will understand. My brother, if this reaches you, please do not go into that house, and don't sell it. Board it up and let it stand forgotten, a creepy old building for people to stare and wonder at. Maybe that will hold them back at least. The sewing machine is going at all hours of the day now. I know that it's him, sewing himself new additions to that terrible cape. She lets him keep the skin, you see. He gets to keep the skin. I am so sorry, Emerson. I don't hate you for the things you did. I wish I could help you, or at least put you out of your misery. I know they won't let you rest. I know you cannot be free of them now. I see them out of the corner of my eye sometimes. They're going to take me to the ship. I won't let them. I will die the way I choose. The sea will carry my body away, hopefully far from where they can ever find it. This letter was found lying beside a cassette tape. The tape proved to be nothing but static, although those who watched it reportedly found a sense of unease and nausea when they tried to view it. The Grimes home was searched and the belongings of over 23 children who had gone missing in the local area were discovered within. No trace of the children themselves was found within the house or near it, however. The basement and the secret room were both as the letter described them. However, no stairs leading down to a further sub-basement were found anywhere on the property. The puppets also appeared to be completely undamaged, despite the claim that they had been burnt. The tapes mentioned in the letter were missing, however. 2 families have since lived in the Grimes home. Neither has stayed for more than a few months, reporting strange smells, odd noises around the house and things going missing. One reported sensing something terrible in the basement, and her children spoke of horrible dreams about the ship taking them away and the bony man from the TV watching them at night. The house is now abandoned, having been purchased and then left empty by one Adrian Grimes in early 2011. The puppets and set pieces from Candle Cove, mistakenly named Pirate Place by Grimes in the letter, an early working title for the show that Emerson Grimes later abandoned, supposedly vanished shortly before Adrian Grimes made the purchase. The whereabouts of Jason Grimes remains unknown. Well, listeners, that concludes episode 80 of the Mysteries Abound podcast. Hope you enjoyed today's show and can get some sleep after that terribly creepy story. So whether it be via the Mysteries Abound or the Origins podcast, this is Paul saying bye for now and keep well, everyone.